And of course, now we get to the NFC North, and I'm sure many of you are waiting for me to go into roast mode once again on the Chicago Bears, and you're probably not fully going to get that. I'm still going to stand by what I've said via tweets and via previous videos about the Bears' performance in the 2017 NFL Draft and what they did, but I don't want to take up all the time talking about just them. I don't think that's fair to the other teams. And I don't think it's fair just to present everything from a negative slant on this draft because I will say one thing about this Bears draft. One way or another, it will be an organization changer. Flat out. If Trubisky is that guy, then it doesn't matter if they gave up a third and fourth round pick in 2017 and a third round pick in 2018 to get him. It won't matter. If Mitchell Trubisky is that dude, if he's a healthy Jim McMahon, which is probably the best of what you're hoping for, is a Jim McMahon type of franchise guy that can actually stay healthy and stay on the field, then the Bears' rebuilding project will be well underway, and we can start to get serious about this organization. And if some of these guys that the team gambled on from small schools, and in Eddie Jackson's case, a guy from a big school with some durability issues, they gambled on athletes. If these athletes pan out, you could look at this draft in 3 years and think a lot better of what Ryan Pace did on draft weekend. You can. Now, one thing, I can get into the whole thing about how it seems like nobody in the NFL really liked the Bears draft. That's usually an indictment of what they did, but that doesn't always 100% of the time mean that those other NFL teams are right. And to be fair to the Bears, I've talked about before, is sometimes the biggest idiots of all are the ones that are actually in the NFL doing the job. And just because they're even in the NFL and have their job doesn't mean they have any clue as to what the hell they're doing. And that's a fair thing to say. And in terms of some of the other picks outside of Trubisky, which I've talked about plenty, it's kind of funny because as much as some Bears fans are going back and forth on me with my opinions about the Trubisky pick and the trading up for him and everything, it's funny. I think I'm one of the few Bears fans that's actually high on the Adam Shaheen pick. Maybe some of that is because he played at Division II Ashland. Maybe some of that's the fact that, frankly, people bitching about the pick didn't watch him. Or it's kind of that stigma of, well, I know some of these other names and they were from big schools, so they clearly have to be better. I'm telling you, Shaheen has freak athlete type of potential. I think the dude's a potential monster as a tight end. I compared him to Martellus Bennett, and I think he's every bit of that as prospect. And think about Martellus Bennett. We think about him in one light now, but early on, when he came out of college, he kind of busted out. He never had really figured it out with the Cowboys. And he goes to New York, then he comes to Chicago, and he becomes a different player. So sometimes it takes time with some of these guys. But I get why you would take Shaheen, where they did in the middle of round 2. I really honestly did not have that much of a problem with that pick. Even round 4, Eddie Jackson, I had no problem with that pick because I thought it was decent value. Here's a guy with some athletic upside and ball skills as a free safety and has some ability as a returner as well, so he could impact the team in multiple ways. It'd be nice if he's able to stay healthy, but that's where a physical talent like Eddie Jackson is available in round 4. I thought it was a fine pick. I know quite a number of people question the Tariq Cohen pick, the human joystick, the running back from North Carolina A&T, talking about, well, you have Howard and then you have Jeremy Langford. Why would you draft Cohen? Again, Cohen has some potential as a returner. He's even a little different from Jeremy Langford. Maybe you're going to try and move on from Jeremy Langford. Would I have taken Tariq Cohen here in round 4? No, I probably would have honestly taken somebody like a Marlon Mack if we were going to go down that route. But I can get why they did it. I understand why they did it, even though I felt like it was a bit of a reach. Again, I could get it. And even taking somebody like Jordan Morgan from Kutztown, Pennsylvania, just because he was at a small school, we're not that familiar with him, and in particular he's an offensive lineman, doesn't mean he can't play. I mean, Kutztown's produced a Hall of Famer before. See Andre Reed. I was a little curious that they would take a guard here in round 5 when there were other tight ends on the board, like a Jordan Leggett that they could have taken. But, or I would have even been okay with them double dipping at quarterback and taking Nathan Peterman. giving yourself kind of that RG3 Kirk Cousins type of dynamic within the same draft. But it is what it is. And I look at this draft class and I say this for the Bears. It's got a lot of risk and it's got a lot of gamble. It's got a lot of upside. It's got a lot of downside. I think the whole these guys played at small schools and that makes the draft bad is a really dumb logic. And I saw that in terms of some of the feedback NFL executives were giving about the Bears draft. Because thinking about it from a Bears perspective, some of the greatest players in the history of the organization played at smaller schools or played at schools that weren't big-time powers. The greatest quarterback in the history of the organization, Sid Luckman, came from Columbia. That's not exactly known as a football power, even back in the days of the 30s. The greatest Chicago Bear that ever has been and will ever be was Walter Payton, and he came from the historically black college Jackson State down in Mississippi. We don't actually think about that as a football power, even though it produced a lot of talent over the years. See Walter Payton, see Jackie Slater, and others. Richard Dent came from Middle Tennessee State. Harlan Hill came from Florida Teachers College, I think it was, whatever the hell it was called. Willie the Wisp Gallimore, going way back in the day, similar to the Harlan Hill time. You're talking about he was a guy came, I think, from Florida A&M or something like that. Pardon me if I don't remember the schools exactly, but these were all small school guys. And these guys were all stars. And, guys that make the list of the top 25, top 5, top 10, top 50, top 100, depending on the perspective, Chicago Bears of all time. So just because the guys came from small schools doesn't mean that they can't play. Even going back in the days of Kansas comic, Gale Sayers, he played at Kansas, which was by no means a football powerhouse, even back then. So to say that the draft sucked just because they took a bunch of small school guys, that's just dumb. That is absolutely dumb. Like, ask Steelers fans that remember the days before the Steel Curtain and Chuck Noll and everybody else. Everybody, when they took Joe Green, 4th overall in that 69 draft, the paper's headlines were Joe Who. Came from North Texas State? And we think of him as the greatest defensive tackle of all time. They built their franchise around a guy that came from a small school and a non-big time program. That wasn't crazy. It worked. I think about Steve McNair back in the Titan, back when they were still the Houston Oilers, frankly, and they took Steve McNair from Alcorn State. If you can play, you can play. So that logic is dumb. Now, with that said, I would have done the draft much differently. I wouldn't have traded up from 3 to 2 to take Trubisky. That's for damn sure. And you can put me on record that I would have went 1 of 3 approaches with this draft, and I'm confident that all 3 of those approaches ultimately long-term will be much better than what the Chicago Bears ultimately did in this draft. Maybe wrong, but I don't feel like I will be. I gave the Bears a D. I didn't want to give them a flat-out F because I did like some of the players that they took. And, I don't think Mitchell Trubisky has total bust written all over him at the NFL level. Like I said, his NFL comp to me, and I thought it was a good one, was Andy Dalton, a guy that you can win some games with, but how many games is he going to win for you? A guy that could be frustrating in terms of his inconsistency. At times can play at a high level, and other times feels like a guy that you want to bench. That's what I can envision Trubisky being. I can only hope and pray that he develops into a Derek Carr, but to me that seems like reaching at least a little bit here. Only time will tell. But, where some people completely savage this draft to no end, I didn't completely savage this draft to no end because I don't think that was entirely fair, because I still feel like they got some good prospects. Even though when you look at this draft, just fundamentally, it looks like a draft that's skewed. It looks like a draft that's off, and it looks like a draft that's ultimately going to be a failure. But that's what I've got to say about that. Now, moving on. The Detroit Lions had kind of a so-so draft to me. I think a lot of people are probably surprised that they passed at Reuben Foster at 21 and took Jared Davis instead. I had Jared Davis higher on my big board, so I understand why the Lions took Jared Davis, and I applaud them for taking Jared Davis. I think he was underrated in terms of his athleticism and 3-down ability. And if he would have been able to be healthy his last year all the way through, I think he would have gotten more buzz, but I like him. It was interesting that they took Tease Tabor in the 2nd round, because here's my thing with him. Even though he ran as slow as he did at the Combine and then ran even slower at his pro day, I don't know how the hell that happens. This is a guy that plays faster on film. Part of that, too, is because his technique is pretty good and his instincts are outstanding for the position. With that said, even though this is an example to me where playing speed is better than measured speed, ultimately the measured speed does matter a little bit for that position. And this is a guy that was 4.6s and 4.7s. It doesn't mean he shouldn't be drafted at all by any stretch of the imagination. It doesn't mean you take him off the draft board. But to me, especially as I started to pay more attention to Tease Tabor in 2016, I thought he was a little bit on the overrated side, actually a little more than on the overrated side, especially when a lot of these mocks had him as a first-round pick. And notice very early on in the process, I dropped off of Tease Tabor as a first-round pick. And, in some cases, didn't even have him as a second-round pick. I think in a lot of mocks, I had him as a third or fourth-round pick. So I was frankly a little surprised here when he ended up going in the second round where he did to Detroit. I was a little surprised because I thought they're frankly better players with better value at that point in time in the draft. I understand why they address corner, and I think Tease Tabor does have NFL potential, but I think that he could always be at a bit of a disadvantage, especially if you're matching him up against speedier wide receivers in the National Football League. But he does have the instincts and some of the other things to mask that and overcome that, and I think he could end up being a solid pick. I liked the Galladay pick from NIU. Jalen Reeves-Maben is one of those guys that's frustrating because the dude just can't stay healthy and stay on the field. If he ever does, and this is probably the pick that could surprise out of this draft class for the Lions. It's just a draft you look at, and it's not very sexy. And that's the truth. It's just not very sexy. And there is some definite potential for this draft to be a real disappointment. Like if Reuben Foster finally hits the field at some point in time for the 49ers and plays to his athletic potential at the NFL level, the Lions might look stupid for taking Jarrad Davis. Tease Tabor might not be able to hang outside at the NFL level as a corner because he just doesn't have enough athleticism and speed in the NFL level, and that's very possible could happen. Galladay has some physical upside, but maybe he just can't get separation at the NFL level. Maybe Reeves-Maben can never stay healthy. This is a Lions draft class that has a lot of bust potential. It really does. For the Green Bay Packers, I kind of look at their draft, and it's one of these deals similar to the Seattle Seahawks in this sense, is that sometimes you could fall in love with the maneuverability of what you do in the draft, and you fall in love with the process and getting the additional draft pick currency and and moving and all of that. But sometimes that's not the right decision. And even though I fully applaud the Packers for taking Kenny King with the first pick in round number 2, because I thought he was a great fit for them. I thought he was the type of corner that they needed. It's a real indictment on what has been the failure so far of Demarius Randall and Quentin Rollins. And then to be able to trade back and get him, I look at a Kevin King too, and I say, with Kevin King, why didn't you just stay put at pick 29 and take him in round 1 and get those 4 guaranteed years on his rookie contract with the potential to extend it to having 5 years with that 5th-year team option? These are the type of decisions that I question sometimes for some of those teams. I think those late first-round picks can be incredibly valuable commodities, and I wouldn't be trying to trade out of them unless a team really made it worth my while. And to go back 3 or 4 picks and get to the top of round 2 and get a 4th-round pick, to me, is not enough because of the salary cap flexibility that comes from getting first-round talents late in round 1 and having the potential to have them under team control up to 5 years, because especially that 5th-year team option for where you picked them in round number 1 is not going to be that costly. Did they really gain much out of moving back a few spots to take Kevin King at the top of round 2? And the answer to me is no. They should have just taken him at damn 29. I got to be honest, when TJ Watt was there at 29, I was actually frankly surprised that they didn't take him. And I think that was good for them in this situation because TJ Watt almost felt like too much of a Ted Thompson Green Bay pick. They had to go in a slightly different direction here, and I thought they did a good job. It was interesting to see them come back in the late portion of round 2 and double up and get Josh Jones, the safety from NC State. They're looking at him for that Micah Hyde type of role. The one thing I will say about, especially once they traded back into day 2, the fact especially that they ended up drafting 3 damn running backs with Williams, Jones, and Mays is maybe at the top part of round 2, maybe you should have really gambled on Dalvin Cook. Or maybe instead of taking Josh Jones at the tail end of round 2, maybe you gamble on Kamara. I understand character is important. I understand you want guys that are clean off the field and all of this stuff. But, I will say this, for the Green Bay Packers, you have Aaron Rodgers. Your window of opportunity to potentially win a championship is however long you have Aaron Rodgers. And that probably is going to be for several years now. But do you want to waste several more years of Aaron Rodgers? You have arguably the best quarterback in the game today. Arguably a dude, if he won a couple more rings, could go into the conversation with Brady and Montana for being the GOAT of NFL quarterbacks all time. And you look at that Packers offense, and yeah, you've got Ty Montgomery, a converted wide receiver, playing there, and Christian Michael, and da-da-da-da-da. But maybe you need a real game-changing back like a Dalvin Cook to take some major pressure off of Aaron Rodgers in the Green Bay passing game. And the fact that Dalvin Cook is such a natural option as a pass catcher out of the backfield and good enough as a route runner to where you can line him up in the slot. You can line him up outside. You run him on routes out of the backfield. You can do all types of different things with him. Maybe that would have been the right approach for the Green Bay Packers, was to do something a little bit different and go with Dalvin Cook. Now, to me, that felt like they did a little bit different going with Kevin King instead of TJ Watt, but I thought they could have done a little bit different. So again, the thing I question the most is the trading out of round number 1 from a salary cap standpoint. I didn't think it made a whole lot of sense. I don't know picking up the extra 4th rounder or whatever the hell they picked up what really made it all that worthwhile, just being honest here. One pick that I think could surprise a little bit is Jamaal Williams, the running back from BYU. I had a 3rd round grade on him, and they got him towards the tail end of round number 4. He could end up being their starter some point in time this year. It wouldn't surprise me if he was. I think the team, though, that, speaking of Dalvin Cook, ended up winning the day for the NFC North was the Minnesota Vikings. I gave them a B grade. They didn't have the 1st round pick because of the Sam Bradford trade, but considering they didn't have a 1st round pick, I thought the Minnesota Vikings equipped themselves pretty well here to be able to trade up and get Dalvin Cook in round number 2. A guy that if you had your 1st round pick, you might have been entertaining the thought of taking him in round number 1. This is why, in part, the Packers might regret it because they have to face Dalvin Cook twice a year. The Chicago Bears, unfortunately, it means they have to face Dalvin Cook twice a year. Dalvin Cook and what he can bring to that offense could make the Vikings organization forget very quickly about Adrian Peterson, and that's just the way it is. Then getting Elflein, the center from Ohio State in round 3, you needed to beef up the trenches. You have to protect Sam Bradford better, and especially getting a guy like Dalvin Cook, you got to be able to run block better too. So I thought they got an absolute murderous steal in Dalvin Cook, a guy who was, the 6th rated prospect on my overall big board. You got him where you did in round number 2. And then Elflein, a guy who I had a 2nd to 3rd round grade on, you got him where you did kind of in the middle of round number 3. I thought that was good. Other guys like Jaleel Johnson, Ben Gideon kind of fit what I think Mike Zimmer wants on the defensive side of the ball. They gambled on athletic upside skill players like Bucky Hodges and Stacy Coley. I thought they did a solid job here. If I was going to say they had a worse pick, it was probably trading the 1st round pick for Sam Bradford. But I don't really want to beat that dead horse. And, based off of the draft haul that they got here, it makes the Sam Bradford trade not quite as bad. It's still bad. It's still a mistake. But it wasn't the worst thing in the world. And when you can come back and have a draft class like this that I feel has a couple of starters and a couple of other potential contributors and some guys with upside, you can feel not as bad about the fact that you ended up ultimately trading away a 1st round pick in this draft for Sam Bradford. That's just the way it is. So I felt like the Vikings were the big winners and the Bears were the big losers. And that's the way it is.